Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are honored today to have Heather Osgood with True Native Media rejoining us with Podcast Movement University. Today's topic, of course, is how to get started with podcast advertising in 2022. Heather has been a tremendous supporter of podcast movement and the podcast community overall. She's helped a lot of podcasters kind of navigate these waters and always has good insights and good perspective on this topic. So we're grateful, Heather, that you're welcome, that you're coming back and you're going to share some more. Before we kick off this presentation, I was hoping maybe you could share a little bit about yourself and True Native Media for those that may not be familiar with you or your work already, and then we can dive right in.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, thanks so much, Jared. I appreciate you having me on. And yeah, I founded True Native Media about 6 years ago, which is a podcast representation firm. So, what we do is we work with about 70 different podcasts, and our role is to connect them with advertisers. So, that's all we do is really focus on advertising and really how we can help shows to monetize their content. It's been a wild ride. The last 6 years have changed, things have changed so much in the industry, which has been a ton of fun. But yeah, I still love podcast ads, and I'm excited to share with everybody today how they can get started into the podcast ad space. So, Jared, I don't know if you can hear me, but would you like me to go ahead and get started?
Sorry, I was muted. Let's go
No.
ahead and bring up your screen.
Okay.
And yeah, I think we can go ahead and get rocking here. So we're going to add the stream. There we go.
Excellent. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started then. So, in today's session, we're going to be talking about how you can pick good sponsors for host read ads, how you can get results for your advertisers, how to create a multi pronged sponsorship package, what services you should offer to podcasters, and how to create a renewal strategy that really works. So, I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about what podcast advertising is. I was recently at a podcast event, and truthfully, I was a little bit surprised that more of the podcasters didn't kind of understand some of the ins and outs around podcast ads. So, I wanted to start with that. Most podcast ads are going to be between 30 and 60 seconds long. There are a few 15-second ads, but by and large, most of them are that 30 to 60-second length. And in terms of placement, we usually have what we would call a pre-roll, a mid-roll, and a post-roll. Of course, pre's are easy. They're at the beginning, mids are in the middle, and post-rolls are at the end. But those are kind of the standard placements for ads. But this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. There's a couple of different types of ads when we're talking about podcast ads that are important for you to know about. So the first is an embedded or a baked in ad, and the second is dynamically inserted ads. So embedded ads are ads that are in a specific episode. So let's say you have an ad for ZipRecruiter that's going to be coming out in episode 100. If I listen to episode 100, I'm going to hear that ZipRecruiter ad. If I listen to episode 99 or episode 101, I will not hear that ad because it's embedded into episode 100. Now, most of the ads, and I would say all of the ads that are embedded, are what we would call a host read ad. And these are host read because obviously the host of the program is the person that is voicing the ad. And in most cases, they are what we would also call an endorsement or an ad that is really coming from the voice of the host about how the host liked the product and they think their audience will like it too. So most of the ads in the podcast space right now, the vast majority of them, about 91% actually are host read ads, meaning the host is voicing that ad. Now, there are also dynamically inserted ads. And how dynamic ad insertion works is that through your hosting provider, so you have to have a hosting provider that can do this, you put ad insertion points into your episodes, and then the ads are electronically inserted across your entire catalog, right? So you could have an ad in episode 1, you could have the same ad in episode 100, and really we're looking at more of a time frame for that ad as opposed to a specific episode. So you might say from February 1st through February 28th, anyone who listens to your podcast is going to get served up that ZipRecruiter ad. So those are the two different kind of types of ads. One of the misconceptions is that dynamic ad insertion has to be that producer read or that kind of radio-esque sounding ad. And it absolutely does not have to be. It definitely can still be host read. So it's important as we get started in this conversation that we understand what we're talking about in terms of ads. So now the premise of everything I'm going to talk about today is all host read ads. And what we want to start with is, how do you select a good advertiser for your program? And the first thing I want you to do is to think about products and services that you personally like. I happen to love Starbucks. I go there probably way too often. And if Starbucks came to me and said, "Hey, Heather, you want to run ads?" I'd be like, "Yeah, that sounds awesome. I love Starbucks and I'd be happy to talk about your product." If a life insurance company came and said, "Hey, you want to run ads?" I might feel less excited because maybe, life insurance isn't something I really would want to talk about. So you have to think about products that you personally can really talk about. And the reason that you want to think about it from that perspective is you're the one that's going to be voicing that ad. And if the ad is not good, then no one is going to listen, and that isn't going to be a help to anyone. So think about products that you would like. Next, you want to think about products that your audience would like. Now, oftentimes, just because you're the host of a show doesn't mean that your audience is the exact same, kind of person, or maybe leads the same life that you do. An example I have of this, one of our business shows, the host is a very successful business person, and he offers advice on how startup businesses can, really succeed. We had come to him with an app for a fitness program. And he's like, "Hey, I've got a personal trainer. I'm not going to use that app. I don't want to talk about it." We were like, "Yeah, well, maybe you have a personal trainer because you're already super successful. But what about your audience? They maybe don't have the funds to hire a personal trainer, and this app could be really good for them." So you have to think about it from your audience perspective as well. Like, what kinds of products or services might they like, and what might they want to hear about? And that kind of dovetails into really knowing who your audience is. Now, many of the hosting providers out there do not provide a lot of very in-depth information about your audience. Maybe they tell you where someone is listening or how they're listening, but they don't tell you who they are. So if you don't know who your audience is, you want to make sure that you go ahead and run a survey or do something so that you understand who is listening to your audience, because the advertiser knows exactly who it is that they want to reach, and you want to make sure that you're actually delivering that audience for them. That leads me to the next point, which is you need to make sure that you're finding these partnerships with a company or an advertiser where you can benefit the advertiser. So it's not just about you liking the product or your audience liking the product, but can that advertiser actually really benefit from the audience that you have? And that goes back to really understanding who is listening to your podcast. If you are, reaching women ages 25 to 45 who live in the Midwest, who are, maybe moms, and you are talking to a company that is looking to reach that specific demographic, it's going to be a really good fit. If they're looking to reach 18-year-old boys, maybe that's not the right advertiser for you. And then lastly, I think it's really important to look around and see who is heavily advertising in the podcast space. And the reason I say this is because if you go to a company that's never advertised in podcasts before, it might be harder, and it will be harder to get them on as advertisers. So if you can look across kind of the podcast landscape and you're like, "Hey, BetterHelp, number one advertiser in this space right now, I'd love to have you as an advertiser on my program." If you feel like it's a good fit for you, they are already advertising in the space. They're going to be easier for you to get than somebody who isn't. All right. So now let's talk about an engaged audience and why that is important. So you really need to ask yourself how engaged your audience is. And the reason it's important for you to think about audience engagement is because if your audience isn't engaged in the content you're creating, they most likely are not going to respond to the ads that you have on your podcast. So how do you know if your audience is engaged or not? My number one recommendation is for you to test their engagement by asking them to do things. If you ask them to sign up for your mailing list, or if you ask them to enter a contest, or if you ask them to, come to your social media page and post a picture of them doing a specific activity or comment about something, are they actually doing those things? Because if you can't get your audience to respond to a request that you have, chances are you are not going to be able to get them to respond to a request that an advertiser has. So it's really important for you to think about making sure that your audience is engaged. Now, my recommendation is to create different test methods for engagement. So, like I said, running a survey can be a really good way of going about doing this. So, you, number one, will get to know who your audience is. And number two, you'll be able to see how many people are responding. We put out a survey a couple of days ago for one of the new shows we're working with. And I checked yesterday, we'd had 167 responses. So, that's pretty decent, right? People are actually responding to the requests that are being made. Next, you want to create a two-way conversation with your audience. As much as we like to talk about the fact that podcasting is this great conversation, and it really still is just you talking, and it doesn't give you that feedback that you might get from a Facebook group, or maybe a Clubhouse, or some of the social media platforms where you can have a two-way conversation. So take the conversation to those social platforms and see if you can get more of that engagement, so you can see what your audience is really interested in. Next, let's talk about the best way to get good results for your advertisers. So you want to make sure that you can actually really get good results for advertisers, because the better results you get, the more advertisers you're going to have. And I don't think that it is always necessarily just common knowledge how to get good results for an advertiser. So we want to go back to starting with a product that you genuinely love. Because you are doing this host read endorsement ad, if you get a product that you don't like, you really shouldn't do ads for them. We make all of these connections, and I talk to so many different advertisers, and on occasion we do get product samples sent to us, even though we're not, the people doing the ads. And I remember distinctly one occasion where an advertiser sent me a product and I was really excited about it. But when I tried it, I was like, oh, I do not like this product at all. It did not really meet any of my expectations. And I thought, gosh, if I were the podcaster and I had to do an ad read for this product, I would have a really hard time with it. We do have podcasters on occasion who will ask us hey, just have all of the advertisers send me products and I'll tell you whether I like them or not. The trouble with that is that advertisers aren't going to just go ahead and send you a whole bunch of product if they don't think you're going to advertise for their program. So you really should say you're going to advertise a product and do the best research you can on the product first. And then if you agree to a campaign and they send you the product, if you really don't like it, you can always reach out and be like, hey, this product really didn't meet my expectations. I don't want to move forward with the campaign. And ultimately, advertisers don't want you to run ads for products that you don't like. So they're going to agree yeah, okay, let's suspend the campaign. But make sure that you like the product, because that is going to help you really create that organic, authentic, native ad read. The other thing that's important for you to think about is asking your audience to support your advertisers. You ask them hopefully to support you in other ways. Maybe you ask them to support you through Patreon or through fundraising of some sort. When you run ads for advertisers, make sure that you're asking them to support those advertisers and use your promo codes, because ultimately that's going to show the advertiser that the campaign really was successful and they're going to want to come back again and again. The other thing is make sure that you're entering into a winning relationship. And what I mean by that is think about how the campaign is structured. It's not uncommon for advertisers to say they want to run an ad, and what kind of results are they really going to get by running one ad on your podcast? Probably not a lot. The other thing is sometimes advertisers have really lofty expectations and they think, man, I'm going to get 1,000 new customers from this one ad that I ran on this podcast. And if you feel like going into it that you are already in a losing position, because based on the way the campaign is set up, you really don't think your audience is going to respond to it, then you might not want to enter that relationship because you know that it's kind of doomed from the get-go. So think about making sure to establish winning relationships. And then lastly, here we want to really make sure that you're continuing to focus on audience growth, because the reality is the more listeners you have, the better results your advertisers are going to get. And the better results your advertisers get, the more they're going to want to advertise with you. So focus on audience growth. I know that audience size it's not easy. It's not easy to, get lots and lots of listeners. And I know when you're trying to kind of get into the advertising game, I think it can be discouraging because I feel like podcasts are like, I just wish my audience was bigger and then I could get more ads. But really and truly, it does matter. If you have a bigger audience, it's going to be much more attractive to an advertiser and it's going to give them better results, which is important. All right, let's talk about putting together a multi-pronged sponsorship package. So we all know we're here to talk about podcasts today, right? So you all have podcasts. But if you're starting out, and I would say if you have an audience of less than 1,000 download per episode kind of podcast, really it is very helpful if you can package together other content that you have. So if you have, for instance, social media that is really active and you've got a following on a social media channel or multiple social media channels, if you've got a nice website, maybe you have a sponsor page, maybe there's show notes or banner ad opportunities. And if you have a newsletter, you can definitely work to combine all of these pieces and put together a package for an advertiser. The reason I would encourage you to do that, especially if your show is smaller, is that the advertiser ultimately is going to get better results because you're reaching a larger audience and you have all of these different pieces that you can put together in a package for that advertiser. The other thing too is that advertiser is going to get those multiple touch points. So let's say somebody listens to your podcast and they hear this advertiser, then they go to your website and they see that advertiser there in your social. They see that advertiser, chances are that audience member is going to respond. And that again is going to create the results that we want. So the next question I always get when I talk about putting together these multi-pronged packages is how much do we charge for a package like this? And that can be a little bit tricky. So I wanted to kind of run through it. Now, podcast advertising is typically priced on a CPM or cost per thousand basis. And the way I always look at that is if you're an advertiser, right? Advertisers or marketers out there are thinking to themselves, how can I reach 1,000 people? And how much does it cost to reach those 1,000 people? So they can compare kind of apples to apples when it comes to cost for advertising. So that's really what we're looking at. And currently in this space, podcast ad pricing is somewhere between about 15 to 50 in terms of a CPM or cost per thousand. AdvertiseCast, which is one of the marketplaces out there, produces, I think it's a quarterly report where they tell what the average CPM was on their platform. And currently that's at about $23 and some change. So that kind of gives you an idea of where podcast ad pricing is. But I would encourage you, if your show, again, is 1,000 or less downloads per episode, to think about flat rate pricing. And usually I say I wouldn't charge less than $100 an ad. This doesn't really make sense for almost anybody involved to run an ad for less than $100. So think about how you would want to price your ads based on the size of your audience. Next, in terms of social media pricing, I admittedly am not a social media expert, but I did do a bit of research and found that if you have about 5,000 followers on Instagram, you could charge $100 per post. If you're looking to run banner ads are running about $50 per banner ad for 500 visitors. So you would want to look at how many visitors are coming to your website in a month and then create pricing based on that. And then lastly, for newsletters, somewhere between 25 and 50 for every 1,000 subscribers who open your email. So don't look at your total list size. I feel like we see that happen occasionally where it's, I've got, this list of 10,000 people, but only 1,000, of those people are actually opening the email. So look at that open rate. So you can take all of these kind of prices and put together a package that you think makes sense for you. One of the recommendations that I have that I think is really important is you want to make sure pricing is a win-win. And what I mean by that is if an advertiser comes to you and they're like, "Hey, I'll give you $100 for a 6-month campaign," you're going to be like, "Nah, like it's not enough money for me to really want to do it." On the flip side, if you go to an advertiser and you're like, "Hey, I'm going to charge you this huge price," and your audience size doesn't really warrant that investment level, they're not going to see the return that they need. And then they're not going to want to keep advertising. So it's really important that you make sure the price is good for you, that you feel good about what it is that you would be earning, but also that you feel confident that that advertiser could potentially get a good return on their investment. Okay, next let's talk about advertiser services. So when you have an advertiser, what should you be providing that advertiser? So first, you do want to make sure that you're setting some sort of an onboarding call with the advertiser, talking about what their expectations are for the campaign. What does success look like at the end of the campaign? What is going to say, hey, this campaign worked? What metrics are they going to be considering? And you want to see if somebody's got these really wild expectations that you can't meet. Again, you might be like, oh, I don't know if we can do that. So you want to get that up front. You want to know their goals. And then you also want to know, how are they going to be tracking those goals? Are they using a unique URL? Are they using a promo code? Are they just looking at overall brand awareness, meaning, hey, we got out in front of X number of people, like we're happy with that. So make sure that you know what it is that they're looking for and how they're going to be tracking results. Next, you want to make sure that you're sending some sort of reporting to your advertiser. If it is one of those multi-pronged campaigns, send them screenshots of newsletters and social media posts. Make sure you're, of course, sending them links to your podcast ads and downloads in terms of like who's listening. If you have any audience comments, I've seen, audience members comment in Facebook groups like, oh, hey, I just went and bought this really cool product that you guys advertised. And, you get some conversation going around that. You would definitely want to pass that on to them. But communication is key with your advertiser because you don't want to just start the campaign, send them an invoice, and then never talk to them again. You want to make sure that you're checking in with them on a regular basis, especially if you're looking to try and establish a long-term relationship with them. So that leads us to a renewal strategy. So you've got the advertiser and you want to renew the advertiser. What does that look like? So the first one is, don't wait until the campaign is over to ask for a renewal. If the campaign is totally done, they've moved on, you've moved on, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, hey, you want to do that again? Like, did you like that? There's less momentum because the campaign has kind of gone dark. So you really do want to make sure that you're approaching them. I usually recommend a few weeks before the campaign is scheduled to end. Hopefully, again, you've had that communication on a regular basis with the advertiser and you know if they're happy or not. If they're not happy, then, do stuff for them during the campaign. And that's why checking in is important. If they're like, gosh, I'm not getting any results, then maybe we need to throw in some additional social media posts, or maybe you could run an additional ad. Maybe you need to rework the ad because it isn't resonating with your audience. So if you know whether the advertiser is happy, then it's much easier to renew the campaign. And as I mentioned, that kind of added value might be necessary if they're not. Really, one of the most important pieces of all this, though, is you have to ask. If you don't ask for a renewal, the advertiser may not renew. And I certainly have had times in my career, where I don't check in with an advertiser like I should at the right time. Maybe I come back a couple months later and I'm like, hey, did you want to renew? And they're like, oh, yeah, we totally did. And I know if I had checked in with them a couple months earlier, I could have gotten the campaign started again sooner. So just make sure that you're asking. That's definitely a really important part. All right. So now let's kind of talk about some next steps for advertising. One of the pieces that I cannot overemphasize enough to podcasters is that if you really do want to monetize your podcast through advertising in particular, make sure that you're treating it like a business. And what I mean by that is make sure that you are setting up a business banking account for yourself, that you're set up with, local and state government to be a business. Make sure you're responding to your emails promptly. Make sure your website is set up and it looks really great and presentable. treat it like a business. And if you treat it like a business, then it will grow like a business. But if you treat it like a hobby, it's really going to stay kind of in that hobby space. So I really can't emphasize enough how important that is. If you are not sure about how to get advertisers and you're like, hey, how do I just go about doing this? The first option is that you can reach out to companies that you think would be a good fit for your show. Again, going back to kind of the beginning of the conversation, if there are specific brands that you really love that would resonate with your audience, you can try to reach out to them. I always recommend that if you're thinking about reaching out to advertisers, don't go to the top. So, what I mean by that is don't go to the largest corporations first. Oftentimes, I think people get this thought in their mind that, like, oh, that company has a ton of money. Like, they won't even think about my show. Like, they'll just give me a couple $1,000s for a campaign. They won't even give it a second thought because they have so much money. But really, the opposite is true. When you're dealing with large corporations, they have very strict guidelines and they're paying attention to every dollar and where that dollar is being spent. And it's really difficult to get to the person who's actually making the buying decisions. So, really, I think that direct to consumer brands are some of the best types of advertisers that you can try to go after. If you can get, online companies who are selling products who are mid-level, look at who's advertising on Instagram, like who's coming up in your Instagram feed. That can be a really good way of looking for advertisers. As I mentioned before, think about who is already advertising on podcasts. If you're like, man, I hear this advertiser all the time, I know they're advertising, try to track them down and find those companies to try and advertise on your show. So definitely it is something that you personally can do if you have the ability and the bandwidth to do it. If you're like, gosh, I don't even think I can do that on my own, then you probably do want to look for someone to help support you in trying to get advertisers. True Native Media, my company that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is a representation firm. So we work with shows that have over 10,000 downloads per episode in a 30-day period, and we connect them with advertisers. So the podcaster doesn't have to do anything. All they have to do is say yes or no to the advertisement, record the ad, and put it on their show, right? So there definitely are representation firms out there that can help you, and some of them will, I would say, go down in size. At True Native, we are kind of upping the size of podcasts that we're working with since we've been doing it for so many years. But there are other representation firms out there that will work with smaller shows as well. And then lastly, there are marketplaces. And if you're not familiar with marketplaces, AdvertiseCast, I already mentioned them once in this presentation, but they have been around. Actually, I think they started the same month I did in 2016. They've been around for 6 years. They definitely can help smaller shows. And it's very easy to just go and put your podcast on their platform. There are other platforms like Zvook is one, Podcorn, let's see, Gumball is another. So if you don't have your podcast listed in those marketplaces, I would highly recommend that you do. As we see the top tier of podcasts filling up with advertisers, what I've been noticing is that the smaller shows are becoming even more appealing because one of the crazy things about podcasts is there's a limited inventory, right? There's only one Dak Shepard, and if his spaces are full, those advertisers have to go somewhere, right? And so as the podcast industry becomes more popular, we're definitely seeing that advertisers are more open to options that they hadn't been open to, let's say, a year or two ago. So make sure that you're listing your podcast on these marketplaces because there are advertisers that really are looking for inventory. So that concludes my presentation for today. I really appreciate you listening. I know we're going to do a little Q&A, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. We also have put together a free audience growth guide because really audience growth is so, so important. If you go to heatherosgood.com, you can go ahead and select that audience growth guide. So thank you guys so much.
Okay, I was just putting that in the chat there, Heather, so everybody can
Excellent.
get their free audience growth guide. Thank you so much. This is excellent as always. So we did have a question you touched on in the presentation, but we can address it again. And
Mhm.
this is from Rico. Rico's work sounds like he's doing a lot of good work and he's helping and he's working on a show. And what's the best approach for when to begin to seek advertisers? So can we just touch on that again?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of when you should try to go after advertisers, I usually say you should have about 1,000 downloads per episode before you try to go find advertisers, depending on who you are reaching. If you're reaching a really specific, very niche audience, let's say you're reaching a certain type of engineer or veterinarians or doctors, your audience can be a little bit smaller because your listeners are going to be so super well, qualified. But if you're doing like a comedy podcast or just like a lifestyle podcast or entertainment, usually you kind of want a bigger audience. But at about that 1,000 download per episode level is when I usually recommend starting to look for advertisers.
Okay, and then this is a good question here. So when you're talking about renewals, right? And you're saying do that before it ends. What does that actually look like? Are you just sending them an email that says, how would you address a prospective renewal?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a big believer in anytime you can actually talk to someone instead of sending them an email, that usually goes better. I think in this day and age, we're so used to email, and depending on your age, you could also be really just used to exchanging emails or text messages. But if you can actually speak to the person, I think that it really is helpful. So what I usually would recommend is setting up a campaign review meeting. So let's say you're doing a 3-month campaign. About 2.5 months into the campaign, say, hey, I want to review the campaign and review everything that's happening as we come to a close here. Could we schedule a call on this date or what have you? And then if you schedule a video call with them, and one of the things the pandemic has helped a ton with is that everybody is so much more comfortable with video calls. I did video calls and remote work long before the pandemic. And since the pandemic, that has opened up so much more, I would say, comfort and ease with video calls. So if you can get them on a video call, get them talking about the campaign. What did they like about it? How did they see it impact their brand? And then say, gosh, this partnership has really been terrific. We'd love to continue supporting your product and talking about your product. Can we look at extending the campaign? So if you can do that, I would say that that's the best. If they say like, I don't want to meet with you, just send me over the stuff, then of course you can just an email say, here's a recap of the campaign and everything that we did. We'd love to move forward with, continuing to promote the product. Is that something you're open to? So that's what I would do.
Okay, and we have a question from our friend Crystal. When it comes to getting your first sponsorship, does it help to present data on previous campaigns that are similar, like affiliate launches or self sponsored programs?
That is such a great question, Crystal. Thank you so much for asking it. I highly, highly recommend that you start a campaign with affiliate advertising. So if you have never have had advertisers on your show and you don't know where to start, starting with affiliates can be a really good way of going about doing that. And essentially, affiliate marketing, for anyone who's unfamiliar with it, is could just go out there and Google affiliate ads for podcasts, and you'll come up with companies that can set you up with affiliate ads. You go and you create an account and you're like, I'm going to promote Amazon, I'm going to promote Audible. And then you have a unique code that you ask your audience to use. The thing that's so great about affiliate marketing or affiliate ads is that they give you a report of how many sales you made. So, and going back to that part where we talked about engagement, you can tell how engaged your audience is by how they are responding to those affiliate ads. And absolutely, I would highly recommend get several campaigns going with different affiliates where you feel like the brands are a really good alignment with your podcast. And then take that information and share it with other potentially paid sponsors, right? on average, this is the kind of conversion rate that I've gotten for these other advertisers. And what's so great about affiliates is that most advertisers won't tell you what kind of conversion rates you're getting. Like most of the time when you start paying, they'll either say it was good or it was bad. They don't usually say like, oh yeah, you brought in 1,000 sales for us last month. They just say, oh yeah, it was good. We want to renew. And so you don't have that same kind of ammunition. So, and I know you talked about self-promoted products as well, but yeah, if your audience is responding to your self-promotion, I would try and weave in some other brands, because that's going to speak more loudly than like, my audience bought my book. But if you can weave in other brands and your own self-promoted products, I think that those are all really powerful.
Okay, this is from Gabrielle, and she says, what if you want to do a podcast about a product brand that is already on the market? How would you suggest you approach them?
Okay, so in terms of doing a podcast, and I guess I'm not 100% sure if you're talking about doing an entire podcast or just an episode about them. Certainly, there are many, many branded podcasts out there, and I would say brand podcasting has become a huge, huge thing in the space. So, in terms of trying to approach them, I would potentially not look for the advertising department, because most of the time the advertising department wouldn't be the part of the company that would be doing something that was more along the branding lines. Usually it might be like more of like the PR side of the company, but going to them and showing them the evidence that having a podcast for their company can be really powerful. There's a lot of information out there. I would recommend just researching branded podcasts. I know Quill does a lot of branded podcasts. Pacific Content is another company that does a lot of branded podcasts, and they've got some great articles on their site. So you could grab, some information about the power of branded podcasts and then try to take that to the company. But yeah, branded podcasts are awesome.
And Gabrielle added, it would be a series.
A series, yeah. So that really is something you would want to go and talk to the show, or I'm sorry, the company directly about, and pitch that you want to do this specific series for their brand. And like I said, I would probably go to like the PR department. Would probably be best.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. This wraps up our Q&A, and we always like to close out with final thoughts. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience today?
Yeah, I would just really recommend that if you want to get into advertising, again, approach your podcast like a business, because so many podcasters treat it like a hobby and then they're surprised when they're not making money. So make sure that you're treating it like a business. Make sure that you are really focused on growing your audience, because audience size does matter. And then lastly, really think about trying to create win-win opportunities for yourself as well as the advertiser, through potentially doing affiliate marketing or really making sure your audience is engaged and would respond to advertisements. So yeah. And if you guys, please download that growth guide. And if anybody wants to connect, I'm over on LinkedIn. That's where I'm at most of the time. So you're welcome to message me over there. Look for Heather Osgood on LinkedIn.
And you mentioned the free growth guide is at heatherosgood.com. So we hope people will check that out. Lots of love in the chat. Of course, Dr. Jenny is saying, thank you. Super informative. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing the typical messages that you're used to, Heather. So we really appreciate you today. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
No problem. Thank you, Jared. I appreciate you having me on. It's been lots of fun.
Rico says thank you too.
So. Oh, thank you, Rico.
All right. Thanks, Heather. We'll see you soon.